Roman Britain. The term itself conjures images of Boudica fighting her rebellion against invaders from a far-off land. Primitive Celts overpowered by the advanced might of the Roman Empire. But what was it really like? And just how Roman were we? Let's get stuck in. Before we do, let's get a brief idea of what Britain was like before the legions arrived. As the Iron Age Britons were not a backwater bunch of barbarians. For a start, they rode chariots and carried swords and shields. They had mostly abandoned their old hill forts and taken to living in smaller enclosures. In many cases, the old round houses are being replaced by rectangular buildings. There were developments in coinage. A lot was happening basically as the Iron Age was rolling to a close. There were also cultural differences between the north and south of the British Isles, as the southern tribes had much more in common with the tribes of northern Gaul, especially around sort of the Isle of Wight area. And in the 1st century BC, a major trade route ran from Saint-Savon in modern-day France to Hengistbury Head and Poole Harbour in Dorset. And this was the area of the Dorotriges tribe. So many finds have been discovered by archaeologists, finds that point to Hengistbury Head being a major harbour with strong connection to the rest of Europe via Gaul. It traded goods like tin, gold, cattle, just to name a few. In return, they enjoyed imports from the Romans, and Roman amphora have been found here long before the arrival of the invading legions. Basically, they were no stranger to Roman wines and other exotic goods. The largest pieces of amphora have actually been found around the Thames and in Essex and Kent, pointing at trade routes from Dover to Calais. The south of England was getting more exposed to the Mediterranean as each year passed, though it is doubtful that these people ever met an actual Roman by this point. They are trading with Gaul. Even amphorae are being brought in by Gallic traders, and it is Gaul who has the connections with the Roman Republic itself. The Romans themselves were already in the process of assimilating Gaul, though they are not at war by this point, though it is inevitable. But in Britain, the money is flooding in from Gaul. Even when tariffs are raised on Gallic imports, the Britons appeared to have the coin to pay it off. The tribal leaders, at least, were very wealthy indeed. Or it might be an idea to explain the geography a little, as during this period, the names of certain tribes are finally given by the Romans. As you can see by this map, the Romans identified certain tribes with distinctive differences. Borders were certainly better defined, at least in writing, since Pythias arrived all those hundreds of years ago. You have people like the Orsini, the Catavaloni, and the Trinovantes, and you can see who goes where. Politically, though, they were locked in a cycle of self-destructive infighting. We know that the Catavaloni tribe and the Trinovantes tribe are certainly at conflict, as one king has slain the other. We'll get to that in a bit. Okay, a quick note on Rome itself. There is no emperor, and there is no empire. Right, instead you have the Res Publica Romana, that is, the Roman Republic. But in 55 BC, the Republic had recently done away with the traditional method of voting in magistrates to control things. Instead, it is currently ruled by 3 powerful men in what is called the First Triumvirate. You had Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, you had Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. The relationship between these 3 men will eventually break down, but that is getting ahead of ourselves. It's politics in a far-off land that has little relevance for the Iron Age tribes in Britain. What is important is the situation in nearby Gaul. The Helvetii tribe, among others, are undergoing an aggressive expansion of territory that puts a strain on the Romans in southern Gaul. In return, Gaius Julius Caesar, as we know him, Julius Caesar, is given command of an army to deal with it. And deal with it he does. Then, in 57 BC, Julius Caesar declares war with Gaul, and in a brutal punitive campaign pushes across the Rhine and into Germania Magna. During this campaign, in 55 BC, he then casts his eyes on Britain. And Caesar's war with the Gauls has its impact on the Britons, as refugees from the beaten Bellovaci tribe crossed the Channel in the hope of receiving safe haven from the British natives, and the Britons were also helping out the Gauls resist the Romans over the Channel. The year before, the seafaring Veneti tribe had faced the Romans at the naval battle of the Mobian and catastrophically lost, wrecking their seafaring culture. The Gallic War was brutal, and Julius Caesar isn't about to let the Britons off the hook. Accepting refugees is one thing, but their involvement in the war is another. Caesar uses this as justification to invade Britain, as well as several other reasons. But he's not bent on conquest, his focus is still Gaul. This is nothing more than an attempt to further his career, as taking the Roman legions to the most furthest point on the map will look good on his CV. It's all about prestige, back in Rome, and war would give him the boost he wanted. And Britain was this mysterious land, full of dangerous barbarians, full of wilderness. To the Romans, this represented all that was chaotic in the world. Of course, we know it was nothing of the sort. But it's Caesar who's writing the books, and it's his point of view that's being heard back home in Rome. Fighting off noble savages sounds a lot better than sacking a bunch of Celtic family settlements. First, Caesar sends Gaius Volscensus over the Channel to take a look. A scouting mission. But Gaius isn't willing to undergo such a dangerous mission, and actually spends 5 days in an area just off the coast. Useless. He had one job. Now, I will quickly mention that Volscensus isn't some low-ranking pleb. He's quite a decorated officer, serving in the 12th Legion. He's currently serving as Tribunus Militum. Most likely, his ship couldn't land due to the natives, which happened to Caesar later. There may have been many factors preventing his landing, which is probably why Caesar didn't give him a right wigging. And Volscensus will continue to rise in the ranks, and when his decade-long military career ends, nothing is known. He probably retired in his homeland, but he may have entered politics. We may never know. Still, here in Britain, he had one job. Next, Caesar sends King Commius to Britain to ease politics a little. Right. Commius has recently been installed as a puppet king of the Gallic Atrebates tribe, who have recently been crushed by Rome. But now he's in Britain, paving the way for the Celts of Britain to become a client state of Rome, under the guise of protection. Yeah, basically, Caesar's trying to run a protection racket. It doesn't go to plan, and Commius is soon captured by the Britons and imprisoned. Soon Caesar will arrive in Britain at the head of an army. Though he's not taken his full might. He needs that in Gaul. Instead, he takes just 2 legions and some cavalry. The 10th Legion and the 7th Legion. Immediately, things are going wrong. Due to bad weather and other circumstances, the ships containing the legions are sort of scattered, detached from the ones carrying the cavalry. Also, he's unable to beach his ships, as everywhere he observes the Britons lining the cliffs with warriors. The Roman general waits until the fleet is gathered before making a beach landing. Still, there was nowhere to land because the Britons had massed on the beach. His troops had no choice but to wade ashore, and were reluctant to do so if not for the standard bearer of the 10th Legion leading the way. As the Romans pressed ahead, the ship's artillery held the hostile Celts at bay. The Britons used cunning, and first sued for peace. During these initial talks on the beach, Commius was unchained and handed back over to the Romans as a bargaining chip, in return for hostages taking during a fight. This was granted. Then, a few days later, came a storm that wrecked the Roman fleet, causing the Britons to disperse and go to ground. The 2 legions stood firm, reinforcing their encampment, yet there was no way they could get the natives to attack, the Britons preferring guerrilla war over a pitched battle with the advanced invaders. The 7th Legion was ambushed while out foraging. It was a game of cat and mouse, and the Britons were mounted on horseback, and they used the chariots for swift lightning attacks. So, bloody-nosed, but far from beaten, the Romans repaired what was left of their fleet, and sailed back to Gaul. There, Caesar would rethink his strategy, his logistics, his approach. The following year, the Romans were back, and it is this invasion that history remembers more. This time, Caesar takes 5 legions. That's a whopping great 25,000 troops. In contrast, William the Conqueror's army is dwarfed by this. They are supported by 2,000 cavalry and a war elephant. Yes, he took an elephant. Probably the first here since the Stone Age. We know that the 7th Legion was back, along with the 10th, but unfortunately, nothing specific is recorded about the others. Though Caesar did use the 12th Legion for scouting in the first expedition. So could they have been used as one of the invading legions here as well? Never know. The fleet was sizable as well. 800 ships sailed from modern-day Boulogne and arrived somewhere on the east coast in Kent, after problems with the tides on the Gulf Stream. Now this is an invasion. Unlike before, the Britons were not willing to engage this sizable invasion force. Instead, they waited for Caesar's men to land and make camp, before harassing them like they did with the horsemen and chariots. Enter Cassivellaunus, a tribal leader that the Britons were rallying around. Now, Cassivellaunus is the first British tribal leader that appears in historical record. It's our first named monarch. In fact, it's the first named Briton that we know of. Yet we know nothing of him prior to the Roman invasion. We do not know who his ancestors were. They are people that have vanished into the inky blackness of prehistory. But here he is mentioned, at the head of an army fighting the Roman invaders. Finally, we have a name! Alas, we don't have a tribe. Caesar doesn't mention the tribe he belongs to, but we do have a location: Hertfordshire. So he may have been the king of the Cassivellauni tribe, who we learn later controlled that area. Either way, he's a powerful leader who has immense control over the south of England, whose culture is very closely connected with northern Gaul. He's the one, by the way, that killed the king of the Trinovantes tribe some years before, the one I mentioned earlier. So, once he's rallied the Britons, Cassivellaunus gives the Romans everything he's got. The Britons had their own way of dealing with the Romans, and it was proving very effective. They'd use horsemen and chariots to draw the cavalry out, leaving the legions without support. Then, the warriors would fight in small dispersed groups that would be replaced by fresh groups as the fighting progressed. They're rotating their troops, basically. Cassivellaunus knew exactly how to fight the Romans. Of course, we only have Caesar's word for this, and he's hardly going to claim to the chaps back home that he beat up a bunch of disorganised grunts. He may have embellished his story. However, the tactics employed next century are very similar. Hit and run chariots, disperse troops, using the woodland as cover. Right. 3 legions were in the process of foraging, and the waves of Britons came crashing down upon them. Here the Romans looked to their discipline and training, standing firm while the cavalry drove the Celts off. A pitched battle and a victory for the Romans. It would be the last time the Britons were confident enough to strike the Roman legions in pitched battle, instead retreating to the Thames, and upon crossing it they lined the bank with stakes. But as the Romans marched on, the Britons were forced to retreat further, beyond the Thames, and into the Cassivellauni territory, which was a place unknown to Caesar at this point in time. Though the tribal king did keep a few thousand chariots in the fight, 4,000 according to Caesar, disputed, he kept them back to harass the Romans as they pushed deeper into the territory, keeping the invaders under close watch. So when the legion scouted out for food or attacked villages, the dreaded chariots were soon to follow, harrying them every step of the way. This was not a war that Caesar was used to. This was fastly becoming a war of attrition. It was more akin to a pack of wolves hunting their prey. The Britons were running the Romans to exhaustion. The Cassivellauni king slowly picking them off before retreating to a safe distance. And so Caesar is forced to keep his legions tightly knit to prevent this. Of course, it wouldn't be Celtic Britain without a little bit of infighting, and the Cassivellauni king was still controversial in the eyes of many Britons. Cassivellaunus has the reputation of being a merciless brute who wipes out his enemies without quarter, especially in the eyes of the Trinovantes, who was a large tribe based in modern-day Essex. Yes, Essex. You're probably thinking the Iceni were Essex, but they're actually from Norfolk. Boudica was not an Essex girl, she was from Norfolk. The Trinovantes were directly next to the Catavaloni tribe, and the north of the Trinovantes were the Sidimagni, who were most definitely the Iceni. And the Iceni sided with Rome, along with the Trinovantes. So, while some tribes flocked to Cassivellaunus, the others sided with Rome, with Caesar. One man being the heir to the Trinovantes crown, Mandubracius. His father being a murky figure, Immanientius, who had lost his life to the Catavaloni king. It isn't even truly known as to when the clash happened, and both tribes were large and had quite the rivalry. Whatever the case, Mandubracius is now the heir. A while back, while Caesar was still in Gaul, he had actually crossed the channel to seek out the Roman general, asking for protection. He seems to have still been with the Romans at this point in time, because his tribe promised they'd support the Roman legions against the Catavaloni enemies if they got their king back. And they got their wish. Before long, the location of Cassivellaunus' forces were leaked, and Caesar sent his legions to the Oppidum of the Briton king, which was a settlement. So it seems that even when faced with a foreign threat, these Britons would rather settle localised tribal squabbles, ancient hatreds, even if it cost them the war. Yet, this settlement was far from unguarded, because Cassivellaunus still had the Romans under tight surveillance. He knew the Romans were stretched too far, and he pounced. While Caesar moved his forces against the Oppidum settlement, the southern Cantiasi tribe attacked the Roman base on the beach. But once again, the Romans stood firm and discipline won the day. The Britons were routed from the field. By now, Caesar was looking to opt out of this obvious stalemate. But like I said, he's not here on conquest. And in September of 54 BC, he sues peace with Cassivellaunus. And the truce would be beneficial to all. And the new Trinovantes king would be respected, having capitulated to Rome. Naturally, a number of slaves were captured, and hostages were also required for Caesar to take back to Rome. These so-called hostages would usually be children of tribal leaders, blackmail chips, to ensure loyalty. You start opposing Rome, your children would meet their end. It was a cruel world. But on the plus side, if you're a good boy, they'd be brought up in the elite Roman world. After all, they were the children of nobility. They'd be treated as such. They'd grow up with Roman ways, Roman customs. They would most likely be fully fledged Romans, with Roman families and Roman children of their own, by the time they returned back to their homeland to take their positions in the tribal aristocracy, bringing with them the ways of Rome, therefore paving the way for assimilation. What's more, Mandubracius was considered a protectorate. He'd now enjoy the fruits of Rome via special trade deals and the like. He was in Rome's good books, unlike the scallywags from the Cativaloni tribe. They were on the naughty step. Once he knew that things were secure, Caesar left for Gaul, never to return to Britain again. Job done. CV updated. Veni vidi vici. Yes, I know. Caesar doesn't say this for a few more years and for a completely different enemy after the Battle of Zela. But it's fitting. Anyway, Caesar had had a taste of Britain, and apparently he hated it, complaining about the weather. Once his expedition was over, he simply returned back to Gaul. There, the Gallic Wars would continue, where Caesar wins a victory over Vercingetorix. Unfortunately for Vercingetorix, Asterix hadn't had his Weetabix. Now he's in a right fix. In a few years he will be executed in Rome. Vercingetorix, that is, not Asterix, because Asterix is fictional. The Britons had dodged a proverbial bullet. Earlier on, I mentioned that the relationship between the men of the first triumvirate was breaking down. It's pretty much over by the expedition into Britain, and Crassus is already dead by this point. Yeah, Rome is about to erupt in bitter civil war, as in January 49 BC, Julius Caesar arrives in Rome at the head of an army, famously crossing the Rubicon with the 13th Legion. From Rome, he opens his war, crushing Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus. Defeated, Pompey flees to Egypt, which sparks up the shenanigans there. And Caesar decides again to play politics, this time with the Egyptian queen, Cleopatra. Soon the Republic had fallen. Rising from the ashes of civil war, Caesar declared himself a dictator for life. Unfortunately, that life would not last much longer, as on the Ides of March, the 15th, in 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated in the Senate, a gruesome death. Still, he had paved the way for the Roman Empire, and the first Roman emperor, Augustus, took control. He's the one who defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, leading Rome into a new era. Okay, but all that is in a distant, far-off land, and the collapse of the Roman Republic had less of an impact to the British tribes. What did have an impact was the conquest of their neighbours in Gaul. The Veneti tribe were crushed, along with their naval power, and the trade route to Hengistbury Head seems to have dried up. There is a decline in Roman archaeology in the area, though other trade routes controlled by Rome do open up. But the Britons had just had their first run-in with the advanced might of the Roman army. If not for infighting, then they may have actually beaten Caesar. Instead, they got off with just a stalemate. Still, they certainly didn't care much for paying tribute to Rome. They were unwilling to become slaves to these foreign invaders. But their culture wouldn't survive unscathed from first contact with the Romans. Leading up to this, they'd already be buying lots of Roman goods. Now it escalates. Tribes like the Trinovantes even adopt certain Roman symbols of prestige. In the Cativaloni territory, the chaps who strongly oppose to Caesar, you see some Roman ways as well. Tableware, including mataria, which is only used in the preparation of Roman food. There's Roman graffiti, but written by Britons. And in these places, you'd be forgiven if you thought that the Romans were living in these places. No, they were Britons. And on the Rhine, where part of the Roman army is stationed, there's demand for British food. And the Britons are buying Roman wine by the shipload. To quote Bob Dylan, the times they are a-changing. If I'm correct, it's gratias tibi ago pro spectantia. Thank you for watching.